There was nothing remarkable about him, nothing that suggested danger, nothing that made people stop and look twice. He wasn't hiding in dark alleys. He wasn't living on the edges of society. He moved through everyday spaces, apartment buildings, sidewalks, quiet neighborhoods, without resistance. People spoke to him. People trusted him. People assumed he was harmless. And that assumption mattered, because some of the most disturbing crimes in modern American history did not unfold in chaos or panic. They unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, while the world continued as normal. This documentary is not about shock. It is not about graphic details or dramatization. It is about how familiarity can blind us, how politeness can override instinct, and how danger can exist, not in the shadows, but in plain sight. People didn't step away from him. They didn't feel the need to be careful. There was no reason to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw attention. He didn't behave in ways that demanded concern. If anything, he blended in. In a society built on routine, routine feels safe. We trust what feels familiar. We relax around what looks ordinary. We assume danger will announce itself, with noise, with chaos, with warning. But some forms of danger don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly. They arrive politely. They arrive looking like nothing at all. There were moments, subtle ones, where something felt slightly off. Nothing specific, nothing concrete, just small hesitations, brief discomforts, instincts without evidence. And in most cases, those instincts were ignored. Because questioning normalcy feels impolite. Because suspicion requires justification. Because society rewards calm explanations, not vague unease. This is how warning signs disappear. Not because they aren't there, but because they don't look like warnings. They look like misunderstandings. They look like awkwardness. They look like moments that are easier to forget than to confront. And so, life continues. People go to work. Neighbors pass each other in hallways. Conversations end without incident. Nothing happens until much later, when everything is suddenly seen differently. This story is not about a single moment. There was no dramatic turning point, no clear signal that demanded attention. What unfolded did so gradually, over time, through repetition and through silence. And that is what makes this case so unsettling. Not the absence of warning signs, but how easily they were absorbed into the background of everyday life. Before anything was discovered, before questions were asked, before explanations were demanded, there was only normal life. And nothing about it seemed dangerous at all. When people later tried to explain what they had missed, many said the same thing. There was nothing that stood out. He did not look threatening. He did not behave erratically. He did not present himself as someone who required caution. In shared spaces, he appeared ordinary. To neighbors, he was quiet, not withdrawn enough to raise concern, not social enough to draw attention. He occupied a familiar middle ground, the space where people assume everything is fine. And that assumption mattered, because in everyday life, we make constant judgments about risk based on limited information. We rely on appearances, on tone, on familiarity. And when those signals align with what we expect from someone normal, our vigilance relaxes. He did not disrupt routines. There were no arguments spilling into hallways, no public confrontations, no moments that demanded immediate response. He moved through daily life without friction, and friction is often what triggers concern. Without it, behavior blends into the background. This is how normalcy becomes protective, not because it proves safety, but because it avoids scrutiny. People rarely question what feels routine. They rarely interrogate what appears controlled. Instead, they adjust their expectations around it. In this way, normal behavior is not neutral. It actively shapes perception. When someone looks acceptable, we assign them acceptable intentions. When they follow social rules, we assume they respect social boundaries. And when nothing immediately goes wrong, we stop looking closer. This is not a personal failure. It is a pattern, a social reflex reinforced by repetition. We are taught to notice extremes, not subtleties. We are trained to respond to visible danger, not quiet unease. And so when danger does not announce itself, it often goes unchallenged. This chapter is not about deception, it is about appearance, and how easily appearance can become mistaken for truth. Normalcy does not draw attention, it dissolves into routine. When behavior repeats without incident, it becomes expected. And what is expected is rarely examined. In shared environments, people rely on quick assessments. A glance in a hallway, a brief exchange of words, a familiar face seen more than once. These moments feel insignificant, but together they build trust. Not deliberate trust, passive trust, the kind that forms without conscious thought. In apartment buildings, neighbors learn to coexist without engagement. Silence is not unusual. Distance is not suspicious. Someone who keeps to themselves is not automatically a concern. Often they are simply left alone. And being left alone can look exactly like privacy. There were opportunities to question, moments that felt slightly uncomfortable, interactions that ended a bit too quickly, situations that didn't fully make sense. But discomfort without clarity rarely leads to action, because action requires certainty, and certainty is hard to find when nothing obvious is wrong. So explanations fill the gap. He's quiet, he's awkward, he keeps to himself. These interpretations are easier than suspicion. They preserve social order. They allow life to continue uninterrupted. And in doing so, they reduce friction, the very thing that brings scrutiny. This is how normal behavior becomes invisible, not because it is unseen, but because it is reclassified as unimportant. Background noise, ambient presence, something noticed once and then ignored. The danger in this process is not ignorance, it is familiarity. Familiarity lowers defenses, it dulls instinct. And when instinct is dulled often enough, it is eventually overridden. In this case, nothing demanded attention loudly enough to interrupt routine. And routine, once established, is remarkably difficult to break. Over time, assumptions solidify. What once felt uncertain becomes accepted. What once caused hesitation is explained away. And eventually, normal is no longer questioned. This is how appearance begins to replace attention. Instead of asking whether something feels right, we ask whether it looks wrong. And if it doesn't, we move on. Because constant vigilance is exhausting, and society is not designed to sustain it. We are taught to trust patterns, to rely on familiarity, to assume stability unless disruption demands otherwise. But that expectation carries risk. When danger conforms to social norms, it avoids detection. When it does not break rules openly, it is not confronted. And when nothing forces intervention, silence becomes the default response. This is not how most people imagine danger. We expect warning signs to be clear. We expect urgency to feel unmistakable. We expect threat to stand apart from everyday life. But sometimes, danger does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It does not interrupt routine. It waits. In this case, normalcy was not a disguise. It was a condition, a social environment that rewarded quiet behavior and penalized suspicion without proof. An environment where questions required justification, but acceptance did not. And so, before any explanation was demanded, before any scrutiny began, before anything was understood, life continued as usual. Understanding this is essential, because nothing that followed can be understood without first recognizing how unremarkable everything appeared. When people look for explanations, they often begin with childhood. They search for trauma, for violence, for moments that feel decisive. But not all absence is dramatic, and not all disconnection is loud. In this case, there were no constant scenes of chaos, no persistent violence, no single event that demands attention. What existed instead was distance, emotional distance that formed quietly and remained largely unaddressed. Within the household, communication was limited. Feelings were not openly discussed. Concerns were not easily shared. Connection was not reinforced through routine. This did not register as abnormal. Many families function this way, and because it looked ordinary, it went largely unnoticed. Over time, that absence of emotional exchange created space. Not space for conflict, but space for isolation. A sense of being present without being understood, of being surrounded by people while remaining internally separate. As a child, he learned to occupy that separation, not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as adaptation. When connection is inconsistent, withdrawal becomes practical. It requires no explanation, and it attracts little attention. This is not a story of abuse. It is a story of disconnection, of emotions that were neither explored nor shared, of internal experiences that remained internal, and of a child who learned early on that solitude was manageable and silence was normal. There is no conclusion here, no clear cause, no direct line. Only an environment where emotional connection was limited and introspection went unchallenged. This chapter does not explain what came later. It only establishes one condition: a childhood where connection was sparse and distance felt familiar. As he grew older, that sense of distance did not disappear. It adapted. In social settings, he remained present, but not fully engaged. He attended school. He followed routines. He occupied the same spaces as others. Yet connection remained limited, not because he rejected people, but because engagement never became natural. Conversations were brief. Interactions were functional. He spoke when necessary, listened when expected. But emotional exchange, the subtle back and forth that builds closeness, rarely took hold. To others, this did not register as alarming. Many people are quiet. Many keep to themselves. Many prefer observation to participation. These traits are common, and because they are common, they rarely invite concern. Social distance is often interpreted as preference, an introverted personality, a reserved temperament, a desire for privacy. These explanations are benign. They allow behavior to be categorized without being questioned. Over time, that categorization becomes fixed. Once someone is understood as quiet, their silence stops being noticed. Once someone is labeled withdrawn, their isolation becomes expected, and expectations shape attention. This is how detachment becomes normalized, not through absence, but through repetition. The same patterns observed again and again until they fade into familiarity. Within that familiarity, internal worlds can remain unseen, thoughts unshared, emotions unexpressed, experiences processed alone. And because nothing overt demands response, nothing interrupts the pattern. This chapter does not suggest inevitability. It does not argue that distance leads to outcome. It simply observes that separation, once established, can persist quietly, unchallenged. What forms in isolation is not always visible from the outside, and what is invisible is rarely addressed. By the time adolescence gave way to adulthood, distance no longer felt temporary. It felt familiar. This familiarity did not present itself as distress. There were no outward signs demanding attention, no visible struggle that required intervention. What existed instead was a quiet continuity. Patterns formed early, continued without interruption. Isolation, once learned, does not always announce itself as loneliness. Sometimes it becomes structure, a way of moving through the world without expectation of connection, without the need to explain internal experiences, without the pressure to be understood. From the outside, this can look like independence, self-sufficiency, emotional restraint, qualities often encouraged, rarely questioned. And because they are rewarded socially, they persist. This chapter does not assign meaning to that persistence. It does not claim inevitability. It does not draw a straight line forward. It simply observes that separation, when normalized, rarely corrects itself. Without interruption, patterns remain intact. What matters here is not what this distance caused, it is what it allowed. An internal world that developed without external reference. Thoughts processed privately, emotions untested through exchange. And because nothing appeared outwardly wrong, nothing intervened. Understanding this is not about explanation, it is about context. Because before anything escalated, before any patterns intensified, there was already a foundation built on separation. Withdrawal does not happen all at once. It begins quietly. By early adulthood, the distance established earlier had shifted inward. What was once separation from others became separation within. He did not seek connection, but he did not openly reject it either. Instead, he narrowed his world. Fewer conversations, less engagement, more time spent alone. Not as a protest, not as a statement, simply as a default. Loneliness in this context did not present itself as pain. It presented itself as absence, an absence of urgency, an absence of expectation. There was no immediate discomfort that demanded resolution. And because nothing felt urgent, nothing was addressed. To manage that internal quiet, he turned to alcohol. Not as spectacle, not as rebellion, but as a tool. A way to soften awareness, to dull emotional friction, to make time pass without reflection. Alcohol did not create the withdrawal. It accommodated it. It reduced sensation, lowered resistance, and made isolation easier to maintain. As use increased, awareness decreased. Thoughts remained unshared, emotions unexamined. There was no effort to explain what he felt, because there was no one to explain it to. And no attempt to seek help, because nothing appeared to require it. From the outside, this behavior did not register as crisis. Many adults drink, many keep to themselves, many live quietly without complaint. These patterns are common, and because they are common, they rarely trigger response. Nothing appeared urgent. That is why nothing was stopped. Nothing external contact diminished. The internal world expanded, not outwardly, not creatively, but privately. Thoughts were no longer tested through conversation. Feelings were not adjusted by response. There was no external reference point to challenge what formed internally. Everything existed in isolation. When experiences are shared, they are moderated. They are questioned, reframed, sometimes corrected. But when experiences remain internal, they are reinforced. They repeat without interruption. They evolve without friction. And over time, they become familiar. In this space, there was no dialogue, no disagreement, no reflection offered from outside, only continuity, a closed loop of perception untouched by social reality. The internal world did not collide with the external one. It existed alongside it. Daily routines continued. Responsibilities were met. Appearances remained intact. From the outside, nothing suggested urgency. This separation is subtle. It does not look like crisis. It does not demand intervention. It resembles privacy, independence, self-containment. Qualities often respected, rarely examined. But isolation changes how meaning is formed. Without exchange, there is no calibration. Without calibration, internal experiences are neither affirmed nor challenged. They simply persist. This persistence does not announce itself. It does not escalate visibly. It does not disrupt routine. It waits. Let silence linger. The internal world, once established, does not require action to continue. It requires only that nothing interrupts it. An internal world, once closed, does not need encouragement to grow. It needs only the absence of interruption. There were no conversations that challenged what formed internally, no relationships that demanded explanation, no external pressures that required adjustment. Daily life continued without conflict. And without conflict, there was no reason to change course. From the outside, nothing appeared unstable. Responsibilities were met, routines remained intact. There were no visible emergencies, no clear signals that demanded response. This is where silence becomes consequential. Not because something obvious is happening, but because nothing appears to be happening at all. Without urgency, systems remain inactive. Without disruption, patterns persist. Help is rarely sought when discomfort does not feel immediate. Concern is rarely expressed when behavior looks contained. And intervention is unlikely when no one believes it is necessary. In this case, there was no moment that required attention. No point where alarm was triggered. Only continuity. Nothing appeared urgent. That is why nothing was stopped. Understanding this moment matters, because what follows does not begin with chaos. It begins with permission. The permission created when isolation is uninterrupted and internal processes remain unchecked. The first boundary is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with chaos. It does not announce itself with urgency. Most often, it arrives quietly, as a decision. There was no sudden break from routine, no visible loss of control. Daily life continued. Appearances remained intact. From the outside, nothing suggested that a line had been crossed. This is because the shift did not begin with action. It began with permission. Permission is internal. It forms when thoughts are no longer challenged, when hesitation fades without being addressed, and when repetition normalizes what once felt unfamiliar. In isolation, the difference between thinking and doing can slowly diminish. At this stage, nothing felt extreme. There was no sense of emergency, no moment that demanded restraint. What existed instead was a quiet recalibration, a subtle adjustment of limits. Boundaries are not always broken. Sometimes they are simply moved, redefined just enough to feel acceptable. And once redefined, they rarely trigger alarm. This process does not feel reckless. It feels controlled, deliberate, contained. Because control creates the illusion of safety. And when safety feels intact, behavior is rarely questioned, even internally. This is why escalation is often misunderstood. It is imagined as impulsive, as explosive, as uncontrolled. But in reality, it often unfolds through careful steps, measured decisions, incremental shifts, each one small enough to avoid resistance. At this point, nothing appeared dangerous, not externally, not internally. The absence of consequence reinforced the sense of permission, and permission, once granted, does not need to be revisited. What matters here is not the act itself. It is the moment when thought no longer felt separate from action. Once permission is granted, the boundary does not return to where it was. It becomes familiar. What initially required deliberation began to require less. What once felt deliberate started to feel routine. And routine, by its nature, does not invite reflection. Repetition changes perception, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Each repetition reinforces the idea that nothing has gone wrong. And when nothing appears to go wrong, the internal cost of restraint increases. This is how normalization takes hold. The unusual becomes manageable. The manageable becomes acceptable. And the acceptable becomes expected. At no point does it feel like a sharp turn. It feels like continuity. At this stage, decision-making no longer feels heavy. There is no internal debate that demands resolution. Instead, choices feel smaller, easier, less consequential. Control remains central. Everything is planned, measured, contained. And because it feels controlled, it feels safe. Control reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty lowers resistance. From the outside, nothing has changed. Daily routines continue. Interactions remain unremarkable. Responsibilities are still met. There is no signal that suggests escalation. This absence of disruption is critical. Without friction, there is no reason to pause. Without pause, there is no opportunity for reassessment. What began as permission has now become precedent, and precedent shapes expectation. Once a line no longer feels like a line, crossing it does not feel like crossing at all. Let the weight settle. This is how escalation hides, not behind chaos, but behind consistency. By this point, nothing felt sudden. Nothing felt reckless. The boundary had not disappeared. It had simply been repositioned. And because that shift happened internally, it left no visible trace. There was no moment that demanded reflection, no external signal that required correction. Each decision stood on the one before it, supported by familiarity and the absence of consequence. This is how internal permission solidifies, not through impulse, but through consistency. Not through loss of control, but through the belief that control remains intact. What matters here is not how far the line moved. It is that it moved at all without resistance. At this stage, the process no longer required justification. It required only continuation. And continuation, once established, creates momentum. From the outside, nothing suggested escalation. From the inside, nothing felt urgent enough to stop. This is the moment that is often missed, not because it is hidden, but because it looks ordinary. Understanding this shift is essential, because what follows does not begin with a new decision. It builds on one that has already been made. Once a process repeats, it stops feeling like a decision. It starts feeling like a routine. Routine does not require justification. It relies on familiarity. What is familiar demands less attention. Less attention means fewer questions. At this stage, nothing felt new. There was no sense of escalation, no perception of change. Each step resembled the one before it, closely enough to feel continuous. Repetition alters perception. What once required awareness now required none. What once stood out now blended in. And when something blends in, it stops being evaluated. This is the danger of routine. Not because it is chaotic, but because it is stable. Stability creates comfort. Comfort lowers vigilance. And lowered vigilance allows patterns to persist without review. From the outside, life continued as expected. Schedules remained intact. Responsibilities were met. Nothing suggested disruption. Inside the pattern, there was no signal to pause. No internal alarm that demanded reconsideration. Because repetition creates its own reassurance. This is how something wrong can begin to feel normal. Not through denial, not through justification, but through familiarity. Familiarity does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply repeats until the unfamiliar disappears. At this point, the pattern did not feel dangerous. It felt established, and what feels established is rarely challenged. Once a pattern establishes itself, it begins to protect its own continuity, not actively, not consciously, but through predictability. Predictability reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty feels safe. When outcomes are familiar, anticipation fades. There is no need to prepare, no need to reflect. The process feels known. At this stage, nothing feels experimental. Nothing feels tentative. Each repetition confirms what the last one suggested, that the pattern can continue without consequence. This is where routine becomes misleading. Because routine feels neutral. It does not signal risk. It does not trigger alarm. It simply exists. And what simply exists is rarely questioned. In familiar patterns, attention narrows. Focus shifts from whether something should happen to how it will happen. Decision-making becomes procedural, automatic. When behavior becomes procedural, it bypasses evaluation. There is no pause to reassess, no space for interruption, only continuation. From the outside, nothing looks different. Schedules remain unchanged. Daily rhythms persist. There is no visible escalation. Inside the pattern, the absence of resistance is interpreted as confirmation. If nothing stops it, it must be acceptable. If no consequence follows, it must be manageable. This logic is subtle. It does not argue, it accumulates. Each repetition adds weight to the assumption that nothing needs to change. This is how routine hides risk, not by disguising it, but by making it feel unnecessary to notice. Over time, the pattern no longer felt like a pattern. It felt like normal life. What had once required awareness now required none. There was no sense of crossing boundaries because boundaries had already been absorbed into routine. At this point, nothing stood out internally. No moment demanded reflection. No signal suggested adjustment. Each repetition reinforced the same conclusion. This is simply how things are. This is how normalization completes itself. Not through justification, not through denial, but through the quiet removal of contrast. When there is nothing to compare against, nothing feels out of place. Normalcy does not announce itself. It settles, it blends, and once blended, it becomes difficult to separate from expectation. From the outside, there is still no disruption. Life appears steady, predictable, contained. There is no visible reason to intervene. Inside the pattern, there is no internal urgency to stop, because stopping would require acknowledging change, and change at this stage feels unnecessary. This is the risk of familiarity. Not that it hides what is wrong, but that it removes the sense that anything is wrong. Understanding this matters, because when patterns become normal, they begin to interact with the world around them. And when that happens, the focus shifts from isolation to access. Trust is not always earned. Often, it is assumed. In everyday life, we are taught to cooperate, to be polite, to be reasonable, to avoid conflict when possible. These behaviors are not mistakes. They are social expectations, and they shape how we respond long before we consciously decide to. When someone appears calm, composed, and familiar, we extend courtesy automatically. We listen. We engage. We give the benefit of the doubt, not because we have verified safety, but because politeness demands it. This is not a flaw of character. It is a learned behavior. From an early age, we are trained to value smooth interactions over uncomfortable questions, to avoid making scenes, to avoid appearing rude, to avoid reacting without certainty. In this context, intuition becomes negotiable. A feeling that something is off is weighed against social norms, and often social norms win. Courtesy culture does not ask whether something feels right. It asks whether there is enough reason to challenge it. And when reasons are unclear, silence feels safer than confrontation. This is where trust quietly turns into access, not through persuasion, not through force, but through expectation. The expectation that people will be polite, the expectation that discomfort will be suppressed, the expectation that no one wants to overreact. At this stage, nothing feels overtly dangerous. Everything appears contained within normal social boundaries. And because those boundaries are respected, they are rarely questioned. We are trained to be polite, even when something feels wrong. Moments of hesitation did occur. They were brief, unclear, easy to dismiss. A pause in conversation, a feeling that something didn't fully align, a sense of unease without explanation. Nothing specific, nothing provable. And because it could not be explained, it was often corrected internally. People did not ignore their instincts, they negotiated with them. They reassured themselves that they were being overly cautious, that they were misreading the situation, that nothing objectively wrong had happened. These thoughts did not come from denial, they came from social training. Courtesy culture encourages self-correction. It rewards calm reactions. It discourages escalation without certainty. And so, when intuition lacks evidence, it is often overruled by reason. This process feels responsible, measured, mature. It avoids embarrassment. It avoids conflict. It preserves social order. But it also delays response, because by the time discomfort becomes undeniable, the moment to act has often passed. In these situations, people rarely ask, "What if my instinct is right?" They ask, "What if I'm wrong?" And the cost of being wrong socially often feels greater than the cost of remaining silent. This is how access expands, not because trust is consciously granted, but because doubt is quietly dismissed. Each moment of hesitation that is overridden reinforces the belief that hesitation was unnecessary. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized. Discomfort is reframed as inconvenience. Concern is reframed as overreaction, and politeness continues uninterrupted. This is not about poor judgment. It is about how social norms teach people to doubt themselves before they challenge others. When hesitation is consistently dismissed, it does not disappear. It adapts. Over time, the responsibility for judgment shifts. Instead of asking whether something feels right, people ask whether they have permission to question it. And without clear permission, they do nothing. This is how politeness becomes a vulnerability. Not because it is wrong, but because it is predictable. Predictability can be anticipated. It can be relied upon. And once relied upon, it creates access. Trust in this context is not personal. It is structural. It emerges from shared expectations about how people should behave in public and private spaces. People assume cooperation. They assume restraint. They assume that discomfort will be tolerated rather than expressed. And most of the time, those assumptions hold. But when they are tested, they do not fail loudly. They fail quietly. Through moments unchallenged, through instincts overridden, through silence that feels reasonable in the moment. This is not how society imagines risk. We imagine threats that demand attention, situations that force response. But some forms of risk operate within the rules. They rely on courtesy. They depend on hesitation. They expand through compliance. Understanding this does not require assigning blame. It requires recognizing how easily normal behavior can be leveraged. Because once access is established, the question is no longer why people trusted. It becomes why the system never interrupted that trust. When people look back, they often ask why no one stopped it sooner. The assumption is simple: someone must have failed. But this chapter is not about individual mistakes. It is about how systems behave when nothing appears urgent. Law enforcement, like any institution, operates on thresholds. Reports must meet criteria. Concerns must be articulated clearly. Procedures must be followed. Without those conditions, action is limited. In situations where information is incomplete, ambiguous, or difficult to verify, systems default to caution. Not caution against harm, but caution against overreach. This restraint is intentional. It exists to prevent misuse of authority, to protect civil liberties, to avoid intervention without cause. And most of the time, it works as designed. But restraint has a cost. When warning signs are subtle, when discomfort lacks evidence, and when incidents do not clearly violate protocol, systems remain inactive. This inactivity does not feel like failure. It feels like compliance. Officers follow procedure. Reports are logged. Cases are closed without escalation. Everything appears orderly. Bias does not need to be explicit to influence outcome. Unconscious assumptions about credibility, about normal behavior, about perceived risk shape decisions quietly. When situations resemble everyday life, they are processed as such. And when something looks routine, it rarely triggers review. This is how missed warnings accumulate, not through negligence, but through alignment with expectation, not through intent, but through consistency. Systems are designed to respond to disruption. When disruption does not occur, systems do not move. Systems are built on process. Process requires order, documentation, clear categories. And when information does not fit those categories, it becomes difficult to act on. Reports are written based on what can be stated, not on what is felt. Language must be precise. Details must be verifiable. Anything ambiguous is often reduced or removed. This creates a gap. Experiences that feel concerning but lack concrete evidence lose weight as they move through the system. What begins as unease becomes a brief notation. What begins as concern becomes a closed file. Over time, these small decisions accumulate, not as errors, but as outcomes of routine. Each case is handled individually. Each report is evaluated on its own merits. Patterns are harder to see when information is fragmented. Decision fatigue also plays a role. Officers process large volumes of information. Most of it does not lead to escalation. As a result, attention naturally shifts toward the most immediate, visible threats. Situations that appear contained are deprioritized. This is not indifference. It is triage. Triage assumes that urgency will be obvious, that risk will stand out, that escalation will announce itself. But when risk blends into routine, it competes poorly for attention. Procedures are followed, forms are completed, cases are documented. From the inside, the system appears to function. From the outside, nothing seems amiss. This is how inaction can coexist with diligence, not because warnings are ignored, but because they never gather enough weight to demand response. When process replaces judgment and urgency is defined narrowly, silence can pass through systems without resistance. When systems fail, it is rarely because rules are broken. More often, it is because rules are followed too precisely. Each step is completed correctly. Each procedure is observed. Each decision is justified within its narrow context. And yet the larger picture remains unseen. This is how responsibility becomes diffuse. No single action feels wrong. No individual decision stands out. Every choice makes sense on its own, but when viewed together, they form a pattern that no one person controls and no one person corrects. Warnings do not disappear, they dissolve. They are separated into parts, filed independently, evaluated without connection, and without connection, they lose force. This is not a failure of intent, it is a failure of integration. Systems excel at responding to clear events. They struggle with slow accumulation, with ambiguity, with signals that arrive quietly and never demand urgency. Bias operates here without declaration, not as hostility, not as malice, but as expectation. When situations resemble normal life, they are treated as such. And when nothing appears out of place, nothing is challenged. This is the danger of waiting for certainty, because certainty often arrives only after damage is done. Understanding this does not assign blame, it clarifies limitation. And it explains why, in this case, intervention did not come when it still could have. When discovery finally occurred, it did not feel cinematic. There was no dramatic reveal, no sudden escalation, no moment designed to shock. The truth did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, through routine actions, ordinary steps, and quiet verification. Nothing about the moment felt extraordinary. There were no raised voices, no urgent alarms, no sense that history was unfolding, just procedure. This is often how reality asserts itself, not through spectacle, but through confirmation. Small details examined, information checked, observations aligned, one step leading calmly to the next. Silence played a central role, the absence of reaction, the absence of emotion, not because the implications were small, but because they were still forming. Understanding takes time, and in those early moments, no one fully understands what they are looking at. There is a tendency to imagine discovery as a turning point filled with intensity, but in reality, it often feels administrative, measured, controlled, almost detached. This detachment is not indifference, it is process. Professionals are trained to remain steady when clarity begins to replace uncertainty. Emotion follows later. At this stage, nothing demanded interpretation, only documentation, only confirmation that something previously assumed normal was not. Let silence hold. The absence of drama did not make the moment less significant. It made it more unsettling. Because when truth arrives quietly, there is no emotional release. Only the slow realization that everything before this point now has to be re-examined. Very restrained narration, long pauses are intentional. As confirmation settled in, attention shifted backward. Events that once felt insignificant were revisited. Conversations replayed, moments reconsidered. Not because they were dramatic, but because they now carried new weight. What had seemed routine was no longer neutral. Silence became noticeable. Patterns became visible. Actions that had passed without comment were now examined with a different lens. This process was not emotional, it was analytical. Piece by piece, context replaced assumption. There was no single detail that explained everything. Understanding emerged through accumulation, small elements aligning, separate observations connecting, each one ordinary on its own, unsettling only in combination. This is how realization unfolds, not through revelation, but through recalibration. The mind adjusts slowly, reluctantly, to information it did not expect to hold. In these moments, there is often a strange stillness, a pause between knowing something is true and understanding what that truth means. Nothing outward changes. The environment remains the same. The procedures continue, but perception shifts. And once perception shifts, it does not return to where it was. This is where certainty begins. Not loudly, not emotionally, but decisively. Once understanding took shape, there was no immediate reaction, no release, no sense of closure. Knowing did not arrive with relief, it arrived with weight. What followed was not chaos, but stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when the implications are too large to process all at once. Nothing needed to be said immediately. There were no questions to ask yet, no conclusions to announce. Only the recognition that what had once seemed ordinary no longer was. This is the moment often misunderstood. Discovery is expected to resolve uncertainty, but sometimes it only replaces uncertainty with something heavier. In the absence of spectacle, there is time to think. Time to understand how many assumptions had gone unchallenged, how many routines had gone unquestioned, how long normal had been mistaken for safe. Silence lingers here because emotion has not caught up. That comes later. What exists now is clarity, quiet and irreversible. Let silence hold. From this point forward, the story changes, not because something new begins, but because everything that follows is now seen without illusion. Interrogation is often imagined as confrontation. Raised voices, pressure, emotion breaking through resistance. But this was not that. What stood out first was not denial, it was absence. There was no visible panic, no sudden urgency to explain, no emotional surge demanding release. Responses came calmly, deliberately, as though the situation required attention, but not reaction. This composure was not performative. It did not appear rehearsed. It did not seek approval. It simply existed. Emotion did not surface easily. Not anger, not fear, not relief. And notably, not remorse in the way people expect to see it. This absence is often misunderstood. It is not necessarily defiance, nor is it admission. It is distance, a continuation of the same internal separation that had been present long before any questioning began. In interrogation settings, emotion often serves a purpose. It negotiates, it persuades, it redirects attention. Here, emotion did none of those things. Answers were provided without urgency. Details acknowledged without visible struggle. There was no attempt to control the narrative emotionally, only to respond. This does not suggest clarity, it suggests detachment. a psychological stance where the external situation does not provoke an internal shift. What investigators observed was not resistance, but disengagement. Emotional absence is difficult to interpret. It does not fit common expectations of guilt, fear, or regret. And because it does not fit, it is often misread. Observers tend to look for familiar signals, visible remorse, distress, an emotional breaking point. When those signals do not appear, assumptions quickly form. Some interpret the absence of emotion as calculation. Others see it as indifference. But emotional flatness does not always communicate intent. Sometimes it reflects a limited connection between internal experience and external consequence. In this setting, questions did not provoke visible reflection. They did not trigger hesitation or emotional negotiation. Responses remained consistent, even-toned, detached. This consistency can be unsettling, not because it reveals something dramatic, but because it reveals very little. There is no emotional contrast to measure against the situation, no shift that signals awareness of impact. This does not mean awareness is absent. It means expression is limited. Understanding exists without the emotional markers people expect to see alongside it. In psychological terms, this creates distance. Distance between what is known and what is felt. Distance between acknowledgement and reaction. Such distance complicates interpretation. It resists narrative. It offers no clear entry point for explanation or resolution. And because it cannot be easily explained, it is often described in simplified terms, as coldness, as emptiness, as lack. But what is observed here is not a performance. It is a continuation. The same internal separation now visible under scrutiny. Interrogation often creates the illusion that understanding is possible, that if enough questions are asked, a clear explanation will emerge. But not all psychological states translate into narrative. Some do not resolve. They do not clarify. They simply persist. In this case, there was no moment of emotional breakthrough, no visible shift that reframed what had already been observed. The detachment remained, consistent, uninterrupted. This does not offer answers. It sets boundaries. Boundaries on how much psychology can explain through observation alone. Analysis can describe patterns. It can identify distance. It can note absence. But it cannot always supply meaning where expression is limited. This is an uncomfortable reality, both for investigators and for those watching from a distance. There is a desire for explanation, for insight that resolves discomfort. But sometimes, none arrives. What remains then is not understanding, but recognition. Recognition of limits, of how far analysis can go before it reaches silence. And that silence matters, because it shapes how the public responds next. Once the legal process began, attention shifted outward, away from quiet analysis and toward public understanding. Trials are designed to establish facts, but public reaction seeks something else. It seeks meaning. Media coverage expanded rapidly. Details were condensed. Context was shortened. Complexity was reduced, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Large audiences require clarity. Clear stories travel further than nuanced ones. In this environment, a familiar frame emerges. The individual becomes a symbol, a monster. Monsters are easy to recognize. They separate us from them. They reassure the audience that danger is external, distinct, and identifiable. This framing offers comfort. If the problem is a monster, then the world remains intact. Systems remain trustworthy. Assumptions remain valid. Nothing about everyday life needs to be questioned. But simplification comes at a cost. It removes context. It discourages examination. And it replaces understanding with distance. The public response often reflects this shift. Shock, condemnation, a desire for finality, not because people are indifferent, but because complexity is unsettling. A complex individual forces uncomfortable questions about trust, about systems, about how ordinary environments can allow extraordinary harm. A monster requires none of that. A monster explains everything by explaining nothing. This is why monsters feel safe. People like monsters because they are easy to understand. As the case moved through the courts, public attention intensified, not toward understanding, but toward resolution. Trials offer structure, clear roles, clear outcomes, a defined end. For many, this structure provides relief. It restores order after prolonged uncertainty. Public reaction often mirrors this need. There is a desire to conclude, to label, to contain the event within a moral boundary. Right and wrong, guilty and innocent, finished. Media narratives adapt accordingly. Coverage shifts from analysis to judgment, from process to outcome, from questions to conclusions. This shift is not accidental. Ongoing uncertainty is uncomfortable. It challenges assumptions about safety, about trust, about how well systems function. Closure allows those assumptions to remain intact. Moral certainty plays a role here. Condemnation feels stabilizing. It creates distance between the audience and the subject. It reassures viewers that what happened belongs firmly outside their own lives. But this distance comes with consequence. When a case is framed as complete, the conditions that allowed it fade from focus. The conversation ends before deeper questions begin. Questions about oversight, about assumptions, about why warnings did not escalate. These questions are harder to resolve than a verdict, and so they are often left unanswered. Closure feels satisfying, but satisfaction is not the same as understanding. As attention begins to shift away, what remains is not insight, but a simplified memory. A story with a clear ending. And endings, while comforting, can prevent reflection. It is tempting to believe that this story is about one individual, that once identified, the danger was contained. But that interpretation is incomplete, because nothing that happened occurred in isolation. This case unfolded within ordinary environments, familiar spaces, everyday routines, places where people assumed safety because safety felt normal. What allowed events to progress was not secrecy alone, it was trust. Trust in appearances, trust in routine, trust that danger would announce itself if it were present. Assumptions played their role, that politeness equals harmlessness, that calm behavior signals control, that discomfort without evidence is not worth acting on. Systems did what they were designed to do. They followed procedure. They responded to clear signals. They waited for certainty, and in waiting, they remained silent. Silence in this case was not passive. It shaped outcomes. It allowed continuity. It allowed patterns to persist without interruption. This is not a failure of morality. It is a limitation of structure, of how societies manage uncertainty, of how systems respond only when thresholds are crossed. When stories like this end, there is often relief, a sense that the danger has passed, that the lesson has been learned. But the most important questions do not belong to the past. They ask how easily normal can be mistaken for safe, how often intuition is overridden by courtesy, how many warning signs arrive quietly and dissolve into routine. This case does not demand fear, it demands awareness, not of monsters, but of processes, of trust, of assumptions, of systems, of silence. The most unsettling truth is not what he did, but how ordinary everything around him was.